Over the years, I've had an opportunity to view a lot of Persian and Indian miniatures, and that inspired me along with working with media having to do with the Silk Road has been a great joy for me. I was invited to teach in Qatar. I taught design and art at Virginia Commonwealth University's satellite program in Qatar. And at first we had only female students, and later, 7 years later, we had male students. But the beauty of living in Qatar was I was on a major trade route. As you can see, Qatar is a little tiny mitten sitting out in the Persian Gulf. At first, it was a tragedy that my artworks didn't get to Ireland as they were supposed to because I was getting ready for an exhibit where I was working on finishing up 50 small pieces. But in the meantime, instead of sitting there twiddling my thumbs, I began to make little drawings having to do with the Silk Road, which turns out to be such a joy because they are really nice to look at. When one looks at old maps going back in time, there are always little monsters and fish and boats and all kinds of stuff that's in the maps themselves. So when I made this little map drawing, I was in Ireland waiting for my parcel to arrive, and I decided that I would make a little backstroking dragon there in the ocean, which kind of tickled my fancy. While living in Qatar, I received a grant to go to the Sanskriti Foundation as an artist in residency. And I made a lot of miniature drawings. I went to the museum as well while I was in Delhi and looked at all kinds of Indian miniatures, which I used as my inspiration for this whole series of trade items, this being silk. Aromatics were traded on the Silk Road. This represents musk with the little deer. There's frankincense in the immediate foreground, and there are aromatic woods around the periphery of this um, miniature painting. They would be agarwood or sandalwood, such things as that. The perfume would be oud or agarwood. That's the most expensive perfume in the world, is made in India and Cambodia. Plus, Oman has frankincense trade with just about everybody that lived in Europe and the Middle East. Plus, of course, India. One of the major trade goods was, in fact, cotton. And it was actually originally made in the Indus Valley with the Harappan civilization. And back in BC, they were actually trading their cotton goods to Egypt, such as you hear of Egyptian cotton initially came from India. Yes, there was an avid trade of precious metals and coinage. Coins were originally minted in China. So this represents gold and copper and coins. But on the top are jewels, gemstones, and jewelry, including in the middle, mogul jewels. And I went to the museum, and they had a whole vault of the original Mughal jewels, which were pretty spectacular. And then at the Sanskriti Foundation, I went to many parties because I was there around Christmas time, and the philanthropist that funded the Sanskriti Foundation had a lot of wealthy Indian friends, and these women that were at these parties were actually wearing the real thing. They were wearing Mughal jewels, which I have to say really excited me. Another great trade item were the heavenly horses that came from Central Asia. They were different than the other horses. They were much bigger, much stronger, and the Chinese wanted to acquire these for their various battles and such. And they were called heavenly horses because when they rode real hard, they bled. They bled, and that's why they thought that they were from heaven. But the truth of the matter was that they had parasites, and that's why they would bleed when people would ride them. Ooh, not so good. But it's a beautiful portrayal of the heavenly horses. On the Silk Road, they traded many medicinals, all kinds of pills and potions. And one of the most interesting story, which is portrayed really heavily here, is they were trading rhubarb. And I was thinking, wow, did they make pills out of it? Or did they just put all those stalks on the camels and horses and track them across the Taklamakan Desert? What did they actually do? And of course, there's a little bit of opium in this picture as well. So I think what they used the rhubarb for was as a laxative. Sea items of trade: coral from the Mediterranean in the area around Italy, and pearls, wonderful pearls from the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, and countries like Qatar and Kuwait and the UAE and Oman were diving for pearls. And they did so until about the 1920s, when the Japanese decided that they were going to invent the cultured pearl. And then their whole industry in the Middle East kind of fell apart. One of the more interesting pieces of information I discovered was sea silk. And it's not depicted here, but they made golden garments out of what's called sea silk. And I wondered what it was. It's only in Sardinia that these oysters with this kind of furry stuff that holds them to the bottom of the sea are still alive and well, because pollution has killed off these very precious clams. And so people would dive down, get the furry stuff that was attaching these clams to rocks and such, and then they would weave it. And biblical references are made to golden garments and such worn by royalty. It would take a lot of clam fur to make some serious amount of knitting to knit up these items. Porcelain china was a big trade item. The Chinese, as well as the Japanese, traded all over Europe and the Americas, and especially coming into Mexico as a luxury item. People tried to imitate what was happening with this fine china, but they couldn't because they didn't have translucent clay there. Also depicted here are swords and knives, and they are made in the Middle East, in Syria, as well as Japan. But this depicts what's called a punch knife, and you hold it in your knuckles, and who's ever on the receiving end, ooh, ouch, ouch, ouch. Skins and furs were traded because people used them for clothing and for warmth and durability. They also traded ivory, which came from tusks and horn and even narwhals and such. One day, a woman came into my studio from Sweden, and she was some kind of a diplomat, and she heard from the people at the school that I was doing these miniatures of trade goods. And she told me, speaking of coming down the rivers into the Black Sea, that the Vikings actually traded on the Silk Road. They were so enamored with the Bedouin jewelry that they began to imitate it. And she gave me a little brochure about this fact, and I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. This next little series of pieces were created in Portugal, as I had a grant to go to Lisbon and the Algarve. And in Lisbon, starting my trip, I went to St. Jerome, that's the translation of the cathedral and monastery, where all of the ship captains and crew would pray before they went on a voyage, their voyages of discovery, which went down the African coast, around the Cape of Good Hope, and up into the Arabian Sea, where they would get pilots to take them across at specific times of the year to India. They were the first Europeans to land in India. So a lot of ships were always docked in the old days in Lisbon Harbor because it was very protected from the Atlantic Ocean. This series of pieces were actually made in Portugal while I had a grant to go there to study various things in Lisbon and also the Algarve. So in Lisbon, there was San Geronimo or St. Jerome Cathedral and monastery where the sea captains and their crews would go to pray before they went on a voyage of discovery. So there were always lots of ships in the beautiful harbor there because they were protected from the Atlantic Ocean. Also, adjacent to that building was where they kept all of the ship models and maps. So I got to see a lot of those, but they never let anybody take photographs. So I had to remember by heart what I had seen. I really tried really hard. There were 17,000 small objects there, so it kind of weighed on my brain a bit. When I got to the Algarve, I made a trip up the coast to where Henry the Navigator's navigation school was supposed to be. Well, there was basically nothing left of it. There was a lighthouse on one promontory and a little, very charming, beautiful church on the other promontory. And I'm going like, where is the school? Aren't they missing something in terms of tourism to not have some kind of major kind of museum there? Because the Portuguese were basically the first people that were globalized citizens of the world and traders. Well, I forgot to mention that Henry the Navigator was also a slaver, the first person in Europe to import slaves from Africa. Bad boy, Henry, bad. Meanwhile, back at the navigation school, they kind of developed and designed a ship that was sturdy enough to go around Africa and onto India. But that was after Henry died and went straight to hell for being a slaver. It was called a caravel. It was a lightweight, very small ship. And of course, it looked a little bit like a walnut shell. But anyway, they finally figured out if they went way out from Africa and then down to the Cape of Good Hope, they could manage to get past the coastal areas where they always ran aground or were killed or various things. So then they were able to go on to Calicut, India, and surprise the Arab traders who couldn't believe these guys are showing up from Europe in walnut shells. And here we have the first slave port in Lagos. Actually, I went there and they had a slave museum, and I could see where Henry put all of his slave money to good work by giving it to the Catholic Church, and in fact, putting gold everywhere inside those churches. They were kind of like plain on the outside and really glittery on the inside. The only other place I ever saw that was Goa, which was a Portuguese settlement until India finally said, we've had enough of this. At one point, while I was still living in Qatar, I came across a kind of oblique reference to the fact that the Chinese luxury goods were traded to Mexico for their silver. So when I got back to the States, I started delving into more research on just exactly how that came about and what happened. And it's actually fascinating, and I can't go into the details here, but when the Mexican silver came to be known, the Chinese said, yeah, we want to trade with you. We want silver. We only want silver. We don't want any of your other goods. We just want silver in exchange for our luxury goods like porcelain, china, and silk. Mexico mined silver and made coins, and they were called pieces of eight. And pirates always say, shiver me timbers, give me some pieces of eight. And 1/3 of all Mexican silver from 1565 to 1815 went to China. Amazing, just amazing. And some of it, of course, was spilled into the ocean, and there are still treasure hunters that occasionally find pieces of eight underwater. This is the Silk Road Codex dress. It's not in the present exhibit, but all the symbols on it are from the drawings I did when I went on an artist residency trip to Delhi, India. Early trade items are at the top of the dress at the waistline, and later trade items are down at the bottom, including 2 barrels of oil, which in terms of trading on the Persian Gulf and such, they would be in the 20th and 21st century for sure.